Thank you for joining us today for a town hall discussion with Congressman Adam Smith. I'm Dave. I'll be your moderator today. The event today will be a great opportunity to hear from the congressman about what's happening in Congress right now and what to expect in the year ahead, and to ask questions about the issues that are most important to you and your family right now. If you'd like to ask a question during today's discussion and you're joining via phone, press *3 to enter the queue to ask a question. If you're joining via Congressman Smith's website, enter your questions in that chat box. And if you're joining via Facebook, enter your questions in the Facebook chat box. If you have personal inquiries on specific cases, updates on your applications, or other related matters, please reach out to Congressman Smith's office using his website, adamsmith.house.gov/contact. Before we turn to questions, we'll hear opening remarks from Congressman Smith. Congressman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Apologize for running a couple minutes late, and I appreciate everybody joining us this morning. There was a lot going on in the country, in our community, and in the world for that matter. I'll touch hopefully quickly on a few of those things, because I want to reserve the bulk of the time for your comments and questions, any issues that you want to raise, that you want me to address, or questions that you want to answer. I will start on a more global scale and then work our way towards what's going on here locally. Certainly much of the focus the last several days has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact of that. This is a profoundly troubling development for the entire globe, but I think especially, obviously, for the Ukrainian people. We have a substantial Ukrainian American population here in the 9th District, and my thoughts and prayers go out to them and their families. I was in Ukraine last August, and this is simply heartbreaking. This is a peaceful democracy that was working, basically trying to provide for their community, figure out how to best govern themselves, that has been violently invaded by a foreign power for no reason. This is an incredibly destabilizing event to global peace and security. We are working with European allies and others across the globe to try and make sure that we support the Ukrainian people in any way that we can, and also condemn what Russia has done. It is incredibly important that Russia not succeed in this effort. We do not want this type of disruption to become the norm. Very difficult situation, but we are focused on it. I do want to emphasize, and I realize I just said that we do whatever we can for the Ukrainian people. We can't go to war with Russia. The risks are too great for the U.S. and NATO to directly go in against Russia. The two foremost nuclear powers in the world cannot be going to war. We continue to try dialogue with our Russian counterparts to try a peaceful resolution of this issue, but this is an incredibly important and disturbing event globally. So we're working on that. On the national level, so look, there's two big issues that have been with us for quite some time, and that is economic inequality and the impacts of climate change that need to be addressed comprehensively, both on the local and community level and nationally. You can see it here in King County, primarily with rising house prices. You can actually have what used to be thought of as a decent job, making $15, $20 an hour in the King County region, and still struggle to be able to afford a place to live, quite frankly. We need to address that economic inequality. And that was the idea behind the reconciliation package that was proposed in Congress and passed in the House to help working families with childcare, with health care, with family and medical leave when that became necessary, to help senior citizens by providing better access to Medicare healthcare services, to actually give them access to dental, vision, and hearing care, and to combat climate change. That was the purpose of the proposal that regrettably did not get the votes in the Senate. But I want to make sure everybody understands what that was about. That was about addressing the income inequality that we face, to help struggling working families, people in poverty, be able to meet those challenges. We need a comprehensive approach if we're going to get back to something approaching equality of opportunity in this country. A whole lot of other issues around that, but that is one big way to help the people deal with the challenges of income inequality, and also to address climate change. And climate change is very frustrating to me because I think we have the technology. If we make the investments in figuring out how to get ourselves off of fossil fuels, I am 100% confident we can do it. There are still people who refuse to see reality and to see the impact of burning fossil fuels has on the planet. We need to get past that, make the investments in better energy technology, more energy efficiency, and green energy options. If we do that, I think we can address that, but that challenge remains. And of course, exacerbating all of that for the last 2 years has been the pandemic, which has had a devastating impact on our community. Certainly, we are approaching 1 million lives lost in the U.S., countless people sickened by that disease, which has been just devastating on so many families and so many communities. At the same time, a lot of the efforts to try to combat the disease, limiting people's ability to interact, and just in general, forcing people to isolate has also created challenges. I think it's especially created challenges for our children. The inability to go to school and interact with their friends the way they would normally do, that the studies have shown has had a profound impact. We need to get past the pandemic as quickly as possible, get people back to work, get people back to school, get people back interacting with each other. It's what human beings do, and particularly for child development is enormously important. I continue to be a huge proponent of vaccination. The statistics could not be clearer. You are 15 to 20 times more likely to suffer severe adverse outcomes from getting COVID if you're not vaccinated than if you are. It is the best way to protect our community and reduce the worst of this disease. I urge everybody to get vaccinated to protect themselves. But we got a lot of work to do in terms of helping our children catch up. I was speaking with a teacher the other day who said that ninth graders are kind of like seventh graders in terms of where they're at academically. We have to work to make sure that we get them caught up in any way that we can and support our children in that effort. In the King County region in general, we also have a growing problem with crime. Public safety is an enormous challenge. We've seen the crime statistics increase. Certainly, we've seen examples of crime, typical laws going unenforced. We need to correct that. And I want to be perfectly clear. I support the idea of restorative justice. I strongly support the idea that every time you break a rule or a law, you don't need to be locked up in prison for 20 years. There are other, better ways to help people rehabilitate and help make sure that people don't reoffend. But it's got to be a balance, and we've got to make sure that no matter how we're approaching that, at a minimum, we enforce the law and we protect our communities. And this is, across the board in our district. It's not just Seattle. I've spoken to people in Federal Way and Kent and Renton, and people are concerned. Businesses are concerned. Certainly, we've seen it in downtown Seattle with businesses that are not opening back up, not just because of COVID, but because their employees don't feel safe going into work. We have an obligation to protect the community. We have an obligation to help all of our citizens. So I've been working closely with our local leaders to try to figure out how we can do a better job of addressing that issue as well. Whole bunch of things going on, and I could probably talk for the full hour and a half here about those. But like I said, this is meant to be interactive. If I'm understanding correctly, you need to hit *3 on your phone if you wish to ask a question. But our moderator knows better how to handle that. So I'll turn it back over to him to take your questions and comments, and I will address them as best as I can. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Congressman Smith, for those opening remarks. And thanks, everyone, once again, for joining us. And just to reiterate the Congressman's directions there, if you are joining by phone, press *3 to enter the queue, to enter your question into the queue. If you're joining via Congressman Smith's website, enter your questions in the chat box. And if you're joining via Facebook, enter your questions in the Facebook chat box. And of course, if you have personal inquiries or on specific cases, updates on your applications or other related matters, please reach out to Congressman Smith's office using his website, adamsmith.house.gov/contact. We gave attendees the opportunity to submit questions ahead of time, so we'll get started with a few of those questions. And the first question, Congressman Smith, is, my wife and I live on a fixed income and inflation is really hurting us. What will you propose to ease inflation on everything we need to live?
Yeah, sadly, when it comes to inflation, the most important thing you can do is the Fed can raise interest rates. And given the impact that inflation is having on our community, I mentioned housing prices, but even if you have a place to live, everything's going up. Now, some of this is caused by the supply chain problems that were caused by the pandemic. The fact that so many places around the world have, been disrupted in one way or another, whether it's China with lockdowns or other countries just having too many employees get sick and not have enough people come into work so they can't move forward. The supply of goods has been restricted. At the same time, in our effort to sort of get through this and to help people who were in the most desperate circumstances, the federal government has provided roughly $7 trillion in economic support over the course of the last 2 years, which has pumped a lot of money into the system. The combination of increased demand and reduced supply has caused a devastating impact. So, in the short term, I think we do need to raise interest rates to get inflation under control, to make sure particularly seniors, people who are living on a fixed income, see those goods and services come back down. The other piece of it is also the infrastructure part. That's why it's very important that we pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill this year that is going to put a little over $1 trillion into building infrastructure, so we can help open up that. We've seen the backup at the port of Seattle, Port of Los Angeles. A lot of that is backed up train traffic, backed up truck traffic. If we open up a better infrastructure, then that allows goods to move more freely and will help with that supply chain problem. I would also say that the other thing that we need to do is to make sure that the workers in that supply chain, particularly truck drivers, are well compensated. In too many instances, they're not. So we've had a hard time getting people to take those jobs. Same with railroad workers. There's no reason, given the amount of wealth in this country, that we can't pay workers a decent wage. We're seeing that right now with a strike with cement mixer drivers. There's a shortage of concrete now because there's a major strike going on. Those workers, those drivers, they deserve decent pay and benefits. And if we don't do that, we lose them, and then again the supply chain gets backed up. But the demand side is important as well, which is why interest rates are crucial. I'll also finally say, and this is more long term, as long as we are completely dependent upon fossil fuels for our energy, we are going to be vulnerable to price spikes. Certainly, Russia's decision to invade Ukraine and the impact that will have on the energy markets and the energy that is being produced by Russia will have that. If we had a clean, green alternative, if we had access to power sources that weren't dependent upon fossil fuels, we would not see those spikes in prices have the same devastating impact. So all of that is what we need to do to address inflation, which I know is just having a devastating impact, especially on families like yours that are on a fixed income or living paycheck to paycheck. There's just not that room to see that type of an increase in the cost of the basic items that you need on a day in and day out basis.
All right, thank you, Congressman. We're going to go ahead and go to some live calls now, and we're going to start out with Mike in Tacoma. Mike, you have the floor with the Congressman.
Yes. Hello, Congressman Adams.
Good morning.
I'm very concerned about the fact that we've lost our energy independence, and I think it's having an effect not only on inflation but on our foreign policy. This disaster that's going on in Ukraine with Russia asserting its control. And I believe if we were more energy independent and didn't have to buy oil from Russia, we would be able to help Ukraine. We'd be able to be more free. So I think there's a pace at which you can switch over to clean energy, but at the same time, I think we've gone too fast in terms of shutting down our resources in this country. And I would like you to respond to that question.
No, certainly. I think it's an excellent question. I mean, energy policy is complicated. And by the way, for the moderator, don't cut them off once I start answering the question. If I'm missing it or not getting there, I want them to be able to cut in and say, "Hey, what about this?" So don't cut them off right after they ask the question. Make sure they stay on the line. Look,
Absolutely.
we are generating a lot of energy here in this country. Energy independence is going to be very, very difficult to achieve because even if we were able to achieve that, even if we were able to produce, whether it's natural gas, oil, or coal, or whatever to meet our energy needs, it's a global market. So the price of that energy would go up if something happened in Russia or if Saudi Arabia decided to restrict the supply. Any number of different things would still drive that price. Simply, being able to crank out all the fossil fuels that we need here in the U.S. will not protect us from that type of inflation. The only thing, as I said, that will protect us is having more alternatives, making those investments in clean burning alternatives. That's wind, solar, biofuels, hydrogen. Clean burning hydrogen is an option. Also, I think we need to continue to do research on nuclear power. If there's a way to generate nuclear power more safely, I think it has to be part of it as well. And then I don't know if you saw, but a couple of weeks ago there was major advance on fusion energy in the UK. If we make an investment there so that we could ultimately get to fusion, that is the ultimate answer. So I agree with you that we need to generate more energy. It's not just about fossil fuels, though. And we can, dig every square inch of the United States of America, and we still would be subject to those markets. And lastly, it is worth pointing out that it seems very, very clear that if we rely too much on fossil fuels, the planet will become unlivable. So we have to balance those two things. We have to balance the need to maintain affordable energy, for people, with the fact that we need to do it in a way that makes life sustainable. So that's the balance that I'm trying to
What?
strike.
Thank you, Representative. I just want to make one comment. It was my understanding that prior to the present administration, we had achieved energy independence. So why is it that we've lost that now?
Yeah, I
What
don't
policies have
believe.
what policies have
Sure.
brought us to that point?
Yeah, I don't believe. Yeah, I don't believe it's true that we had achieved energy independence. I know that under the Trump administration, we were still importing energy from a variety of different places. It's a global market that moves back and forth. Energy generated here in the U.S. is also sold overseas. So all I'm saying is that even if we generate as much energy as we possibly can, we are still part of that global market. And price, and I mean, the $4 a gallon you're paying, for gasoline may be based on, oil that was generated in the U.S., but it's still $4 a gallon. So energy independence doesn't necessarily save us from a high cost of energy. What will save us is having alternatives. So we're not completely dependent upon fossil fuels. We need to do both. And also the environmental impact is a very real thing. So that's what we're trying to balance. But to answer your question, without question, under the Trump administration, they were willing to drill all over the country in far greater amounts. The Biden administration has placed some restrictions on that, no doubt about it. They have, not granted some of the leases that the
Right.
Trump administration was going to grant. There's no question, and that has an impact as well. I won't deny that.
Is it true that we're buying oil from Russia today during
I
this
don't know the answer to
during
that.
this
I don't know
war?
the answer. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that
I,
question.
I
I'm
what
gonna
I
have to
saw in
let.
the news is that we're buying
Yeah,
597 barrels a day. 500 and I don't know the
yeah,
exact
sir. Let me.
figure, but we were
Yeah,
buying a lot of oil per day,
yeah. We're gonna have to move on to some
and so
other folks now. But
we were in
sir,
effect subsidizing his war.
yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if we're buying that oil or not. I'll have to find out and get that information back to you. And let's take the next caller.
Okay.
All right, thanks for those questions, Mike. We're going to go to Megan in Seattle next. Megan, you're on live with the Congressman.
Hi, Congressman. Thank you so much for taking my call. I actually earn quite a wonderful salary. I am a tech worker. I lifted myself up out of poverty. I paid for my own degrees. I am from this damn district. The problem I'm having is that I've been illegally sued for eviction because my landlord just wants to sell the house for like the fourth time this year or some other crap. Additionally, they straight up defrauded both me and I'm sure all the people who are next in line for the house. I've also had to, right, defend myself in court, as it were, to get my rights as a disabled person at work. I've now had 3 companies blatantly violate the ADA to my face. And somehow all of that's on me. Why is that on me? Why is it that you are telling me about people being afraid to go back to work, being very clear about, what Weyerhaeuser exec has you on speed dial, and again, also talking about working families, but seeming to not understand that even well-capitalized tech workers are struggling to afford their basic dignities in this, again, not just economy, but political climate. I'm really struggling to understand what you as a congressperson are doing for somebody like me who's had to take my employer, my landlord, to court 3 times in a year.
Yeah. Several pieces of that. I mean, the biggest thing that we're doing is, we have put into law, and I have consistently supported the ADA, which means that the law should be on your side. And I would urge you also, we can be helpful if you have those problems. So reach out to my office directly because the law is on your side in the situation that you just described. We have passed federal laws. Not only that, there are people in place, people who work for the Justice Department, for the federal government, who can sue on your behalf, that basically can enforce those laws because they are federal laws that I have supported to protect people from the ADA. There are also laws on the books in the state and the federal government, again, that I have supported that protect tenants from landlords. There is a long stretch of law there. And there are also people, as I said, who work for the county, who work for the state justice departments, who are there to take on those cases on your behalf to make sure that those laws are enforced. Now, what I can't do is I can't personally force every company, every landlord to make sure that they're following the law every second of every day. But we have gone to great lengths over the course of my career and even before that to make sure that the law protects people in your situation. And if it's not doing that, reach out to my office. We will reach out to the Justice Department. We will reach out to the AG's office here in the state of Washington and make sure that that law is being enforced. That's what we can do.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that question. Next up, we're going to go to Cheryl in Kent. Cheryl, you're on the line with the congressman. What is your question?
Yes. Hello. Thank you for taking my call. My question is in regards to early childhood educators. I am an early childhood educator and have been working in this field for over 30 years. And I keep hearing things in the government that they are going to do things to help employees with payroll for their workers. And I do recall that there was a pilot program whenever Governor Locke was in office that it worked out to where something like there was they paid for half of the child care workers' the salaries and everything. But whenever it came time for cuts, the pilot program got cut, so it was no longer there anymore. So I would like to know is, with me working in this field for over 30 years, I cannot live by myself and survive. I make $15.48 an hour, and I cannot live by myself alone in a 1-bedroom apartment and pay all of my bills. And I work 40 hours a week, but I still cannot make enough money to take care of myself. So I would like to know what the government is doing to help fix the problem.
Well, the biggest thing we did or tried to do was that reconciliation package that I talked about that would have given universal access, to pre-K, 3 and 4-year-olds, access to pre-kindergarten funded by the government. Also, support families being able to afford childcare. Give them economic support so that we could spend more on childcare workers. I mean, that was one of the cornerstones of the reconciliation proposal, the so-called Build Back Better plan, I'm not fond of that particular acronym. But the point was to help working families with exactly the situation that you've just described so that we could afford to pay child care workers a higher price and actually protect them. And that was the biggest part of that bill that I thought was most important in terms of helping people with the economic challenges that they face. We have a child care crisis in this country. Early childhood development is not available. It's not well compensated. That was the main purpose of that act, which regrettably did not pass in the Senate. We're still trying to have those conversations, but at the moment, I'd be lying if I said the outlook was optimistic. But we want to focus on that. And the other thing is, and I think you raised the exact point, in my district, in King County and the Puget Sound region in general, you can't afford to live on $15 an hour. I support the $15 an hour minimum wage as a way to help drive up wages, but we need to pay workers more across the board. We have rewarded shareholders and executives over the course of the last 50 years, but your average worker hasn't seen that increase. I would think of my own situation. I grew up in SeaTac, and my father was a baggage handler for United Airlines. And the wages that he made in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s were enough to support a family in SeaTac. The wages that your average baggage handler at SeaTac makes right now could not even begin to support a family in the Puget Sound region. And meanwhile, United Airlines, for whom he worked, seems to be doing just fine. Shareholders, executives have seen their wages and compensation go through the ceiling while the workers have not been fairly compensated. We need to put pressure on companies, and we need to change corporate law to make sure it better reflects workers instead of just shareholders, number one. Number two, housing, the cost of housing in Puget Sound. We need more housing supply. We need more affordable housing because your rent alone is going to eat up the bulk of that salary. So it's both things. It's number one, well, it's three things really. Taking better care of child care workers, making sure there's adequate funds there to compensate them and to support families who need access to child care. Two, it's making sure workers in general get paid a better wage. And three, it's bringing down the cost of housing. It has just exploded in King County and priced, far too many people out of the market. That's the general approach we're trying to take to what you correctly identify as one of our society's biggest problems, as I mentioned in my opening remarks.
Yes, it's like that. Like I said, there's been like when Governor Locke was in, there was a program, there was a pilot program and everything. But when it comes to cuts, when it's time to make cuts, it seems like that's where it starts, is with the young children. And that's the first thing that goes, okay, we got to make a cut here, so we're going to do away with this program. How do we stop that from happening?
Well, like I said, in terms of where I was at in Congress, the United States House of Representatives, we passed a very aggressive bill to fund all of those programs and not cut them. As far as what happens with the state budget, we also supplied a lot of money. The state budget, they're about $7 billion to the good right now. So they shouldn't be making cuts in the current budget environment. Their budget is more than robust enough. But it will always be a challenge. It's not something you can take for granted from one year to the next. We need to prioritize childcare. It's just that simple.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Appreciate
Thank you very much for taking my call.
Thank you.
All right, and thank you all for joining us on today's town hall discussion with Congressman Adam Smith. Again, if you're joining us by phone, press *3 to enter the queue to ask a question. If you're joining via Congressman Smith's website, enter your questions in the chat box. And if you're joining via Facebook, enter your questions in the Facebook chat box. If you have personal inquiries on specific cases, updates on your applications, or other related matters, please reach out to Congressman Smith's office using his website. That's adamsmith.house.gov/contact. We'll go back to the phones now, and joining us is Cindy in Seattle. Cindy, what is your question for the Congressman?
Yes, thank you for taking the question. I wanted to find out what Congressman Smith and the Congress at large is able to do to continue to improve access to behavioral health care, particularly for people with addictions.
Absolutely, that's a huge part of the challenge in our region, in the country for that matter. And it's certainly, access to mental health services was always important, but during the pandemic, it's become even more important. A lot of the money that we passed in the last 2 years, the CARES Act, the Recovery Act, a few other supplementals, went to support healthcare services. I can tell you, I visited the CMAR, the Federal Way Community Healthcare Clinic, and they have received quite a few dollars that has given them a greater ability to hire mental health professionals and to provide that mental health behavioral services when people come in. That $6 trillion that we passed in the last 2 years has helped expand that access. I will say that I think we need to really concentrate and focus more on mental health, not just the access, but the type of treatment that we provide to actually give people help. I'm really worried about the fact that we rely entirely too much on medication when it comes to dealing with mental health problems. And I will tell you, I have a lifelong anxiety problem that became debilitating on a couple of occasions. And, both occasions when I sought help, that was the first thing they did, is gave me pills, which did not help. In fact, over the course of time, they made it worse. So I really think what King County Behavioral Health, just to start there, needs to do is to build up an organized plan for how they're going to help people when they come on, how they're going to help people with drug addiction and treatment. We've passed a lot of money in the last 2 years. I want to make sure we put that money to use and comprehensively help people. Make sure that, if you have a problem, you know where to go. There's an intake, there's a place to go. I mean, part of my problem when I started having mental challenges was, who do you talk to? What's the access point? I think we've started to get a little bit better on that. Certainly you've seen more public service advertisements. You've seen, a lot more celebrities come out talking about mental health issues, so that I think people feel a little bit more comfortable seeking those services. But still, all along the continuum of behavioral health help, if you're in that situation, or if you have a family member or a friend who you're trying to help, it is still not clear where to go. And the services that you receive are way crazy inconsistent. So I would hope that with the dollars that have been provided, we can bring people together in the county and say, let's build a more comprehensive, accessible system. And I know there's a lot of people working on that, and I'm certainly one of them, but we need to do a lot better.
Thank you very much. That's a great answer. One other piece that perhaps the government can help with would be housing for those people that are homeless, because a large number of them have behavioral health and addictions problems, and the federal government hasn't been helping with that much in recent years.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've met with Mark Domes, who's the head of the Regional Homeless Authority. And, one of the biggest points he makes is the access to affordable housing. They talk a lot about, single occupancy apartments. The ability to get, a relatively small place that you can afford is just gone, because there's so much more money in building, larger market rate apartments and housing. So that if you aren't, on the high end of the economic scale, there's just no market for you. And I think we need to aggressively build those housing options. Certainly for people who are dealing with homelessness or an economic crisis or a behavioral health problem, drug addiction, anxiety, depression, something that, knocks them back for a period of time, you need to be able to have something that is affordable, that can provide, a basic living space at an affordable rate. And those things just don't exist in the county right now. And let me just say, I get in a little trouble here, but I know there's a lot of controversy as the county is going out and buying up hotels to provide space to people who are homeless, and in some cases, people with behavioral health. We have to have those facilities. We just do. Otherwise, the people will be living on the streets, and that's not safe for the individuals, and it's not safe for the community. I respect, community members who are concerned about public safety, but we have to have some place that people can afford to go when they're in those circumstances. Now, I will also say that I think it is the obligation of the county to make sure that laws are enforced and communities are protected while we do that. But we need to get affordable housing in this region for people, because it's not good for anyone to have people living on the street. And that's the bottom line. Thank you very much. Questions, comments?
All right, thank you very much, Cindy. Next up, we are going to go to Kathleen in Federal Way. Kathleen, what is your question for the Congressman?
My question is about crime and the addiction problem because as of late here in Federal Way, I mean, I've had 2 cars stolen. My friend had her car bombed, and it's just crazy. And the police have to, like, their hands are tied and they can't do anything. I mean, my friend, when she got her car firebombed, they had it on camera and they still said they couldn't do anything about it. So I'm very, very concerned because of the addiction problem that's leading to all this crime, people's houses being broken into, cars stolen, it's crazy. And I was wondering, what you are going to try to do about that.
Oh, I think there's a whole. You're right. I mean that is the biggest issue that I consistently hear about from my constituents. And like I said, there's a lot of focus on Seattle. It's not just Seattle. It's South King County, Federal Way, SeaTac, Kent, Auburn, Renton. All are experiencing these challenges. And I think there's a series of steps and an understanding of how we need to approach this problem. And I think we got in trouble a little bit from a legitimate viewpoint. As we moved in the 80s and 90s, the solution to crime was simple: mass incarceration and very aggressive policing. And as we came into the latter parts of 2010 and beyond, we began to see the cost of locking so many people up. So there was a legitimate and I think very well thought effort to say, hey, is there a better way to deal with this? Is there a better way to protect communities and to make sure that you deal with people who are committing crimes? And I don't have a problem with that. Like I said, I think there are plenty of models for deferred prosecutions, a whole bunch of different things you can do. However, I think that's been taken too far to the point where significant impediments have been put in place to enforce basic laws. Some of it is from Supreme Court decisions, limiting the ability of law enforcement to pursue probable cause if they see or suspect something and to actually pursue a suspect. Some of it is laws that were passed by the state legislature. Some of it, to my mind, is law enforcement misinterpreting some of those laws that were passed by the state legislature to imply that they can't intervene in certain circumstances. They can't make arrests in certain circumstances. But beyond any shadow of a doubt, right now, the perception of law enforcement throughout King County is, that they don't have the tools they need to enforce the law. And we need to change that. Okay. We need to make sure the law can be enforced. And certainly if you see people committing crimes, law enforcement is there to make those arrests. Now, once the arrests are made, once the charges are filed and prosecution is done and a person is convicted, we can have a very robust conversation about what the best way is to protect society and to help that person. And I think there's a lot of stuff that we've learned, in psychology and elsewhere about how to do that, and we should employ that. But right now, the decision seems to have been made in a lot of jurisdictions. We're not even going to make the arrest. Okay, we're just, we're going to let it go, and it's having a devastating impact. And for my friends on the left side of the political spectrum who want to see a more restorative justice model, who want to see us take efforts to help people who have committed crimes in addition to protecting the community, I would say if we don't address this issue, if we don't begin to better protect our communities to stop things as basic as shoplifting and car theft and property damage, if we don't figure out a way to protect communities, then vastly more conservative solutions will be employed because members of the community will not stand for not being safe. They won't. We have got to come up with a better plan because what's going on in King County right now is simply not working.
No, you're right. It's not.
And I thank you for sharing that story, and we will do our best to try and
question.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Kathleen. And next, we're going to stay in Seattle, and we're going to go to Charles. Charles, you are on live with the Congressman. What is your question?
Hello, Congressman. Good morning.
Good morning.
I have a two-part question. I had a webinar the other day at the World Affairs Council. They were talking about food insecurity around the world, and also mentioning food insecurity among our military personnel here in the United States. And I wondered why that is and what's being done about it. And a related question is that a lot of the work that used to be done when we had a draft, when I was in uniform, is now done by contract personnel because there's less uniform personnel. Are the people who do that work paid more or less or the same as our military personnel, our uniform personnel?
Yeah. Starting with the second part of the question first, it really depends. It depends on the contractor. It depends on the service being provided. By and large, they are better paid in my experience from what I've seen of the contractors. But again, it depends on what service is being provided. And I don't know the ins and outs of it. The first part of the question is something that we've worked on, and just last year we passed a fund to help with food insecurity amongst service members. The reason that it is happening is in large part a lot of the stuff that we've talked about already on this call. The cost of living has gone up significantly. So if you're living around Fort Lewis, for instance, or Joint Base Lewis McChord these days, it is a lot more expensive to live there. I know some people who are at Fort Campbell in Kentucky, which is really close to Nashville. And Nashville has just exploded and become a much more expensive place to live. So the cost of living has gone up significantly for service members. And if you're talking about entry-level members of the military, particularly in the Army, which is our largest service, that's relatively low pay when you're coming in as a private. You're just getting started. It's also the case in the military. Military members tend to get married younger and have children younger. So you have 22, 23-year-old privates living on a basically base level beginning salary in the military, trying to support a family of 4 or 5. And that economic pressure has simply put them to the place where they qualify for food stamps, where they need help with their food. So we specifically have put in place a law this year to say, let's look at those employees and let's raise that pay and raise that compensation so they aren't facing that food insecurity. The bottom line is our service members are getting pinched by the same economic realities that a lot of the rest of us are. The wages of your average salaried worker have not gone up commensurate with how much some of the basic housing, being the big one, but the basic costs of living have increased. Energy costs as well. I mean, healthcare costs have been kept down for our service members, much lower than for others. But basic inflation in those items has exceeded pay, and we are working to balance that out because no service member should be facing food insecurity.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm glad that you're working on that and you're going to do that. I wonder if there's an imbalance between how much is spent on weapon system and how much is spent on personnel. I'm sure that's one of the things that you have to juggle with.
Yeah, no, I mean, the other thing, personnel costs have gone up significantly, in large part because of healthcare costs. The amount that your average service member contributes to the healthcare costs has not gone up by nearly as much as it's gone up for other workers. So those costs are increasingly being absorbed by the Pentagon, by the taxpayer. Personnel costs have gone up significantly. I will also say that, and I've been working very hard on this as well, we need to get more for the money we spend on our weapon systems. Without question, we need the weapon systems, but we've had a number of programs that have gone way over budget, or in some cases have never actually been achieved. And that gets me into a very long-winded answer about acquisition and procurement reform, which we're working on. But yes, the Pentagon and the government in general can get more out of the money they're spending so that there would be more money left over to make sure we're adequately dealing with federal employees in the military and elsewhere. Thank you. I appreciate your comments.
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, no one took better care of me than when I was in the Navy. Say that for the medical system.
Good to hear.
All right. Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you for the answers, Congressman. We are going to be asking our constituents participating in today's town hall a couple of poll questions. And the first poll question is, what do you think should be the top priority of Congress heading into the new year? Dial 0 if creating jobs and growing our economy is your top concern. Dial 1, protecting Medicare and Social Security. Dial 2 for improving our healthcare system and lowering healthcare costs. Dial 3 for protecting our democracy and voting rights. Dial 4 for preventing gun violence. Dial 5 for securing our borders and enacting immigration reform. Dial 6 for supporting K through 12 and higher education. Dial 7 for protecting our environment and tackling climate change. Dial 8 for investing in transportation and infrastructure. And dial 9 for eliminating government corruption and waste. We're going to go back to the phones now, and we're now being joined by Joan in Seattle. Joan, you're now live with the Congressman. What is your question?
Good morning, Congressman. I know the voting rights legislation stalled in the Senate, but I am very concerned about what's going on in various states and nationally. Is there any way that you see that any kind of voting rights legislation can get through this Congress?
I think that's going to be extraordinarily difficult, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I'm very disappointed in that because in this case, we had the votes. There was a majority of members of the Senate who supported the voting rights legislation that we passed, but they were unwilling to get rid of the filibuster to pass it. Personally, I think the filibuster should be gotten rid of entirely from the Senate. It has no place in a democracy. It is, as far as I know, unprecedented in any democracy in the world that you ever create a situation where you need more than a majority to pass basic legislation. Sometimes people put in place a supermajority for tax increases or different things, but the idea that just any old piece of legislation is always going to require 60% instead of 50% plus one is simply wrong, in my view. It'd be better if we had a legitimate democracy in our bicameral legislature, but we don't. And the senators are the ones that would have to vote to get rid of that, and we don't have 51 votes to get rid of the filibuster right now. So we're stuck with that. So I don't see this Senate passing voting rights legislation, to be honest with you. Now, it's too important an issue to just walk away from. I think we have to keep pushing it. I think we have to keep putting pressure on folks because the basic concept that everyone should have a right to vote is at the core of our democracy. We haven't always lived up to it. Certainly that concept when the Constitution was written basically meant white male property owners. But in the years since then, we have expanded the franchise to everybody over the age of 18. And so everyone over the age of 18 ought to be able to have access to the vote. And it's really important to point out what's going on in some of these states. They are aggressively, in Republican-controlled states, they are aggressively trying to restrict the ability of people to vote, especially in urban areas where Democrats, and oh, by the way, people of color tend to live. They are, limiting polling hours. They are limiting the days in which you can vote in advance, early voting process. They are going so far as to limit the number of drop boxes where you can drop a ballot in to be picked up. And all of that is simply a punitive effort to make it more difficult for Democratic-leaning portions of a state to vote. I mean, Texas was the most blatant about it, in that they restricted voting hours, they restricted drop boxes, they restricted all of that in urban areas. In rural areas, they actually expanded the hours that you could vote. Of course, rural areas being consistently Republican voting. I mean, this is a pretty aggressive assault on the basic concept of democracy, and it ought to be better protected. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court a number of years ago made decisions that weakened the Voting Rights Act that had been passed in 1965. So it is up to Congress to strengthen that, which we did in the House in a couple of different bills, the For the People Act and then the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The Senate, as I mentioned, even though they have the votes, they don't have 60 votes, so they have not been able to pass it. The other thing I'll say, and I hate to have to say this, but if this situation remains where it's at, then a lot of groups are going to have to work hard to help people vote. These laws make it more restrictive. They don't 100% block people. So we are going to have to go through a lot of efforts to try and make sure that people do, in fact, exercise their right to vote, which is not the way it should be in America. But these are the circumstances that we face right now.
Just a follow-up question.
Sure.
You said we have to put a lot of pressure to make it happen. I emailed both Senator Sonoma and Senator Manchin on several occasions. What else can we do from Seattle on this issue?
Yeah, it's hard. I don't have any brilliant ideas on that. I will say that the way you typically pass things is you got to be patient and persistent. And the persistent part is to keep making the argument. Send another letter. There are organizations and groups out there that run ads and do public education campaigns about this issue. I don't know one off the top of my head, but support those groups, that are out there trying to educate, not just reaching out directly to Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, but to their constituents. Get the people in West Virginia, the people in Arizona, frankly, the people all across the country. Get the people to care about this issue, and that ramps up the pressure on it. And it's not terribly satisfying in the sense that it's not like, okay, if you do this and do that and do that, you will succeed. It's just a long-term effort to try to raise awareness and get people more concerned about this issue.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, we're going to go to Joseph in Renton. Joseph, you're on the line with the Congressman. What is your question?
Hi, thank you for taking the call. I wanted to ask about this year being a midterm year, and all the projections. It's likely looking like the Democrats will be the minority in the next Congress. And so maybe I just wanted you to kind of talk about how you plan to govern or to legislate from the minority, and like specifically maybe whether Nancy Pelosi is the right person for minority leader, especially because of how out of step with you and rest of the country she was for the in terms of owning individual stock for Congresspeople.
Yeah, several pieces to that. I want to start with the sort of how you govern thing. And I think this is really important. And it's one of the issues that I didn't touch on in my opening remarks. And that is sort of the state of democracy in America in general. And certainly January 6th is the greatest example of how our democracy is under threat. With people, basically forgetting what it is that representative government is all about. Representative government doesn't mean that you win all the time. Representative government should mean that your voice is heard, you have a chance to participate, and then there's a fair outcome that we all accept. That's the way it's supposed to work. And we're losing that in place of sort of this idea of respect for the process of representative government. We've been replaced with ideology. My ideas must win. In order to move forward. And I think that's made it more difficult for us to, function and deal with a number of the issues we've talked about here today. With, affordable housing, income inequality, healthcare, crime. These issues that, we have not adequately addressed are in part because people aren't working together to try to solve problems. That is my approach to public policy. When I decided to get into politics way back when I was 23 years old and I decided to run for office, I didn't decide to run for office because I knew all the answers. I wasn't going around, SeaTac and Des Moines and Normandy Park and Kent knocking on doors telling people vote for me because I know exactly what we need to do and you need to let me get into a position to do it. I ran for office because I wanted to work with my community. I felt that I could listen to people, bring a diverse group of people together, hear their differences, and come up with a reasonable outcome that we could all live with. That's what representative democracy is supposed to be about. Pragmatically, practically working together to try and best solve problems, understanding that we're never going to fully agree on what those subjects are. So whether I'm in the majority or in the minority, that's the approach that I take. I don't believe in bipartisanship for bipartisanship's sake. Okay, I'm not going to support a bill just because, oh, look, we got D's and R's on it, so that makes it better. Now, it depends on the issue, and it depends on how we handle it. I am going to listen to Republicans and listen to Democrats from all across the political spectrum, because I think we need to hear those voices. Number one, so that people actually feel like they are included in the decision. But number two, because that's how you get the best result. I mean, I like to think of myself as a reasonably well-informed, intelligent person. There's a lot I don't know. And there are a lot of days when I come up with ideas and I think it's great. And then several people say, yeah, well, did you think about this? And I'm like, ooh, yeah, no, I didn't. The collaborative process is better. Okay. It is a better way to pull people together, which is why, and this is a tough title, but one of the most offensive things I thought Donald Trump ever said was when he said, I alone can fix it. That is not my experience of how the world works. It's got to be collaborative. So I'm comfortable moving in the minority. I'd be a lot more comfortable if I thought the Republican Party had completely rejected the January 6th crowd in the effort to overturn the election. I'm worried about, how much influence the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Lauren I can't remember her first name, Lauren Boebert, I guess, how much influence they have on the process. But I know sometimes in politics you lose and you go back to work. That's the way it's supposed to work, and I'm perfectly willing to do that. I'll say two things further. Number one, it ain't over yet. Certainly it's always difficult for the party in power in the first off-year election when their party is in the White House. And we have challenges that we're going to need to address, but we'll see how that comes out. One way or the other, I'll work with people. And, I take your point on Speaker Pelosi. I have worked very closely with Nancy since becoming chairman of the House Armed Services Committee in particular. I've worked with Nancy on that process that I just described. How do you pass legislation? How do you get things done? There is no better legislative leader in the 30 years I've been doing this than Nancy Pelosi. I mean, her ability to listen to people and work with people, all across the spectrum to deal with our incredibly diverse caucus, it's a tough job, and she does it well. And yes, I'm aware of the fact that she comes from a part of the country that is, a little outside the mainstream. San Francisco is extraordinarily left, liberal, progressive, and all of that. And I'm also aware of the fact that she's worth a hell of a lot more money than I am and ever will be. But in working with her, she seems to understand people in a pretty broad way. And like I said, I cannot overstate how much of a challenge it is to work with people who have widely differing opinions. That's what democracy is supposed to be about, but it's hard. No matter who you are, you have your own thing, your own experience, your own background. How do you then bring in and deal with folks who are combative and different? And I've watched a lot of people try to do it. And I was a Nancy Pelosi skeptic when I first got to Congress and when I worked with her. But having watched her, I don't know that there's anybody else in our caucus who could do it better right now. Eventually that will have to happen. She is 80 years old, 80 years old and has more energy than anybody I've worked with. So there will have to be a transition at some point. I just want to give you that particular insight. Having actually watched her work, I think she's doing a pretty good job.
Thanks for the firsthand experience. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right, let's move to Chris next in Mercer Island. Chris, you're online with the Congressman. What is your question?
Congressman Smith, thank you so much for hosting this meeting and also being so open and taking all of our questions. One thing that just deeply concerns me is just that we're living in, what many are calling a post-truth era. It used to be that the pendulum swung back and forth. I remember when, Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House and got along with Republicans. It seems like those days are over, and the way that fundraising happens doesn't seem to suggest that anyone's being compensated to go back to those days where the two sides talk to each other. I was just curious if you could offer your thoughts, which is a little bit dovetailing on the last question about our democracy. What you think, if anything, can actually be done about this to actually bring the two parties back together and talking to each other.
Yeah, it's a real problem, and you identified what really drives that problem, and that's the money. Marjorie Taylor Greene in the first quarter of 2021, I guess it would have been, raised $3 million, which for those of you who don't know how this works, that's a lot of money. I haven't ever raised $2 million in an entire 2-year election cycle. She raised $3 million in one quarter by just being outlandish, by being destructive, by screaming at people, by being as, crazy is the wrong word. With my mental health background, I have a lot more respect for not overusing that word, but just being outlandish, being divisive, being difficult. The problem is with the internet, with social media, you can reach people that way. And I think one of the bigger cautionary tales is Elise Stefanik, obscure member, well, not obscure anymore. I guess she's in Republican leadership. She served on my committee, on the Armed Services Committee. And when she first came in 2012, she's a pretty good member. I mean, she was, certainly a Republican, but, she worked with us on the committee, reasonable, smart, capable. But then I was talking with a member of the Intel Committee the other day about how when the first impeachment of Donald Trump was going, and she was on the Intel Committee, and as you remember, the Intel Committee was in the middle of that, she started defending Donald Trump. And the second she started defending Donald Trump, her fundraising went through the ceiling and a light bulb went off in her head. Hey, this is a way to get attention. And so you've got that pulling at our ability to go and have that model that I just described about, reasoning together, working together. And as far as the fact-free thing is concerned, I'm deeply worried about that as well. And I think the reason that we have abandoned truth is because we have put ideology ahead of reason and rational thought. We are so convinced that we are individually right that the end justifies the means constantly. If facts help us, great, okay? But if they don't, well, they're simply in the way of what we know the truth is. And what I want people to understand is what I said earlier, okay? Those facts that contradict your beliefs, they lead us to truth. Because, we're human, all right? None of us know everything. None of us know a tenth of everything. I represent 750,000 people. I've lived in this district my entire life. I've lived in the Federal Way area. I've lived in Kent. I've lived in SeaTac. I live in Bellevue now. I've probably knocked on 100,000 doors over the course of 30 years. I like to think that I'm as closely connected to the district as I represent as I could be. But I'm just one person. I don't know what, someone, think of the callers who have talked to us today and the experiences they've had. I haven't had those experiences, okay? I've got to learn from those people. We have become so caught up in ideology. We have been taught, here is what you need to believe. These are the things that have to happen. I wish we would teach people that it is an iterative process. You grow in your understanding, and you grow in your understanding by learning from people who disagree with you. I'm interested, if I see a headline that I think is wrong, I'm going to read that article, okay? Because it's got a perspective that apparently I don't have. Now, a lot of times I read that article and I'm like, okay, I see why they're wrong. And that's fine. But a lot of times I also read that article and I'm like, I never thought of that before. We've got to start teaching that in school, everywhere, that it's not about, okay, these are the absolute right things to do. It's about learning. It's about working together with other people and learning from them. And we've just gotten away from that for a whole series of reasons. So, and there's no simple solution to this. But what I do is I say what I just said, and I also live it. Okay. If I'm, this is my opinion, is where I'm going, and something comes up that proves me wrong, I have no problem going, yep, I hadn't thought of that. You're right. I'm wrong. I apologize. I'm going to fix that. So I try to lead by example.
Thank you so much for that answer. I'm a teacher, and I always tell my students, I think one of the most intelligent answer is, I don't know, but I'll look into it. Because it's admitting your limitations of knowledge and your curiosity to learn more about the issue. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break from the phone calls just for a second to ask the second poll question. And that question is, what is your impression of the COVID-19 situation in the United States today? Press 1 if you think it's getting better. Press 2 if you think it's getting worse. Or press 3 if you believe that it's staying the same. And now back to the phones, and we're going to go to John in Federal Way. John, you're on live with the Congressman. What is your question?
Sorry, is that me?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
we
you're
got
on,
you.
John.
Beautiful. So mine is a bit heavy, and I'm sorry for that. So in the past, there'll be a bit of a past component as well as a current, and then my question is at the end with a bit of a future concern. So in the past, under the Trump administration, we failed the Yazidis and the Kurds in Afghanistan. To an extent, we haven't really supported our Afghan refugee friends and neighbors. The current crisis in the Ukraine is pretty horrific, and I don't know how much you know about this, but there's a Tigray revolt in Ethiopia.
I know a lot about
funded
it,
by
yes.
Okay, so you know about the Egyptians, the dam that's being built, and the existential threats
Yes.
to them. What sort of humanitarian efforts are we preparing for here and abroad to assist with these crises around the world? I mean, we've said never again so many times, and then we fail them again and again. Whether that's the people of the Balkans or in Rwanda, or in Iraq or anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, no, I think you asked one of the biggest questions about the world in general, but U.S. involvement in it as well. And I think that the challenge that has been sort of laid bare ever since the Cold War ended, and U.S. world's sole remaining superpower, and clear vision. You want to go out there and create a peaceful world and try to stop situations like the ones that you have just described, which happen over and over again. Myanmar, the same challenge there. The Uyghur population in China and what they're facing, and it's really frustrating and it's really difficult. And I will say this, I think not we, but the U.S. international community, I work with groups like Oxfam, Mercy Corps, there are other governments in the Western world and elsewhere that I think have developed pretty good humanitarian aid systems. We've learned a lot from some of the earlier mistakes in terms of helping people deal with healthcare, wiping out polio, the efforts of the Gates Foundation, for that matter, to try to help go out there in the developing world and give people peace, stability, and opportunity. I forget always what the Gates Foundation's slogan is, but it's something to the effect of dedicated to the idea that everybody should have a shot at a decent life. Okay, that you shouldn't face violence, you shouldn't face famine, you shouldn't face healthcare that you can't address. And there is more money and more effort being spent on that, and overall, globally, in the last 50 years, the extreme poverty rate has come down significantly. But then you have the violence and the disruption that is caused by a wide variety of different interests pursuing that. How can we help with that? Well, part of the problem is, and Ethiopia is a great example, and I'm not, I've got a very large Ethiopian population. Some of them are Tigrayan, some of them are Ethiopian, and they really don't agree on exactly what's happening there. But beyond any shadow of a doubt, it is a violent, chaotic situation in which average civilians are suffering enormously. So we're trying to figure out, how do you get humanitarian aid in? Well, you can't get humanitarian aid in if there isn't some measure of stability. All right. Humanitarian aid groups are incredibly heroic and brave. Sorry, we also didn't even mention what's going on in Yemen, which is one of the Yemen, Syria. You mentioned Syria, but Yemen is a problem as well. How do you get humanitarian aid into an area that is in violent conflict? And the aid groups are brave, but they're not going to go wadding in there if they're not even going to get the aid to people, and they're going to face those violent reprisals. And typically, well, then you want to provide security, which was the Afghanistan issue. But foreign militaries can always come in and provide security. We experienced this in Somalia way back in 1992, when we went in there on a humanitarian issue, got dragged into a local conflict, and it didn't end well. So there is no easy answer to your question. I will say that I think it is a bit of a mistake to look at it and say that if any of these things are going on, it's because the U.S. has failed. There is only so much we can do to bring peace and stability to other parts of the world. And frequently, when we try, we stumble into making the conflict worse. So I spend a lot of time trying to resolve those issues. I don't think we can just ignore it. I think we should try to help where we can, but understand how difficult it can be.
I guess my point would be a bit more directed in, are there any specific, humanitarian proposals or bills or even, things that, you either know of or are in support of that would help these communities that, are
Absolutely.
suffering and that we've made certain like obligations or promises to in the past?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it depends on where you're at. I mean, it's all over the world. I would say in Ethiopia and Afghanistan and Yemen, part of the problem is the conflict is so great, getting that aid and assistance in is difficult. But there are a lot of aid programs that we have come up with to provide, food, healthcare, clean water. There are a number of aid programs. Personally, I think we can do more. I think we can better organize our foreign assistance, work more closely with private and partners in other countries. But yes, there are a lot of programs that are focused on this, and I think we need to do more. I think as the richest nation in the world, we should try to find ways to help develop the developing part of the world. Because I talk about income inequality in the U.S., inequality globally stirs a lot of these conflicts. So yes, there are a lot of programs. I'd have to go back and look at them. And if you could, if we could make sure we get your contact information, we can get you more specifics on those programs. But it's something that I think it's very important to me. I'm the co-chair of the Caucus for Effective Foreign Assistance, and really try to work on ways to provide help in those areas.
I hadn't realized that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your time, Congressman. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John. And now we're going to go to Eric in Seattle. Eric, you're now live with Congressman Smith. What is your question?
Thank you. I appreciate it. So I would like to know why we're not sending U.S. equipment, air power, and possibly troops in Ukraine to help those people.
Because we don't want to go to war with Russia is the short answer to the question. And it's, well, look, as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, as I've watched over the course of the last couple of days, I've had moments when I'm like, I know the power that we have. I know the Navy that we have. I know, the 82nd Airborne, and the desire to say, you know what, let's go in and let's stop these people, is pretty strong. But the bottom line is, Russia has nuclear weapons. We have nuclear weapons, and if we get into a specific shooting war with Russia, the possibility of this expanding into a conflict that jeopardizes even more people in the region and potentially the globe is too great. We are working with our NATO allies and others to try to supply the Ukrainians with weapons. That just it's been fast moving, so I don't know the specifics, but in the last 24 hours, NATO and the U.S. have approved substantial increases in aid to the Ukrainians, not just weapons, but also economic assistance and other ways to assist them. And we're trying to do that, but that's the delicate line we have to walk. Getting into a direct conflict with Russia, I think would would expand the humanitarian crisis, not sink it. Sorry, not shrink it. And as painful it is to watch. Because, like I said, I visited Ukraine. I was just actually in Eastern Europe last week ahead of the Munich Security Conference. I was in Poland and Estonia, and the people in that part of the world, they are the best advertisement for economic and political freedom we have. They lived under the Soviet Union for decades, in basically horrible economic conditions for the last 25 years or 30 years now. They've come out of that. They've built better economies. They've built better democracies, and they have much better lives for all of their people. Protecting them in that is something we should do to the extent that we can, and certainly shoring up Poland and the Baltics and Romania, so that this doesn't happen there is part of it. But it's very difficult to watch and not want to do more. But we have to balance those risks.
Well, I would say they're a budding democracy, and there's a lot of people in this area that have Democracy Now! Stickers on their car, and I'm saying that this is now.
I understand that. I guess I would ask if you think it's worth going to war with Russia. And
I don't want to go to war, but I think that we have the ability to at least defend Ukraine, and I don't know it would have to automatically become a war with Russia if we just draw the line and have drones and air power in there to destroy tanks if they cross that line. We're not going to war with Russia. We're defending Ukraine. If they want to, escalate it, if Putin threatens nuclear missiles, then at that point, I think that we are justified in taking him out. It's not something that I really like to do, but we have a humanitarian crisis right now, and an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we could have had forces in there protecting those people. And I don't think that necessarily means war with Russia, and we can communicate that with them.
Yeah. Look, I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying, but just from a dictionary definition standpoint, if we send U.S. assets into a war zone and start killing Russians and destroying Russian military equipment, that is the working definition of war with Russia. Now, you can say, okay, maybe we could contain it, but there is no question that if you're advocating us to use our military might to kill Russian soldiers and to take out Russian military assets in Ukraine, that is war. And I don't think there's anyone on the face of the earth who wouldn't interpret it that way. Now, whether or not we could contain that war in the way that you just described, that's a more debatable point. It's extremely risky, but please, let's be clear. If we use our military assets to confront Russian military assets, whether it's in Ukraine or anywhere else, that's going to be interpreted as war with Russia, and we'll have to be prepared to handle the consequences of that.
Well, seems like that's a risk we might need to take.
That's a fair point, but it is a risk, and it's a risk I know President Biden and our U.S. leadership is weighing right now.
I appreciate that. So we have the Odin system, do we not, that can shoot down nuclear missiles?
We have missile defense, yes. I have quite a bit of experience in dealing with missile defense. Missile defense is never perfect. Even in Israel, relatively small area, very manageable, because one of the keys to missile defense is the radars, okay? The anti-ballistic missiles are only part of it. You need the radars to send them to the right place. So the bigger the area, the tougher it is to cover where it might be coming from. You can't get them all. You're never going to shoot down every missile that's coming at you. So we do not have any kind of absolute protection against Russia's nuclear arsenal hitting us here or hitting Europe.
I'm not wondering.
That's going to bring us to the end of our question and answer period. We do have one final poll question to ask our constituents. And that question is, what is your impression of the country's economy today? Press 1 for getting better, 2 for getting worse, or 3 for staying the same. And we're going to open the floor one final time to Congressman Adam Smith for some closing remarks here before we end the town hall discussion. So, Congressman Smith, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I want to thank everyone for participating in the call this morning. I am optimistic that the next time we do this, we'll be back in person, though I do want to continue to do these. I know when I do in-person town halls, not everyone can make it, depending on the timing, depending on their ability to travel, or where the event is. I certainly appreciate in-person fundraisers, like to be able to have people see me and see them as well. But I also like doing this to expand the number of people who can do that. I think all the questions today were really outstanding, certainly reflected the challenges we face collectively as a community and as a nation. So that's why I think it's important we continue to do these events. And I just want to close with the thing I always say, please contact me anytime. I know we did not get to every question that people had, but this is not your only opportunity to tell my office what you think we ought to be doing. Please email, call, contact us anytime, either with issues you want us to address or questions you want us to answer. We want to be as responsive as we possibly can. As I was speaking earlier about the necessity of representative democracy, listening to all voices. It's the biggest thing I believe in, is that representative democracy is the best way to govern anything. But that only works if I'm listening to you. I am your voice in Congress. I want to hear from you. Nothing is more important to me in my office than being responsive to our constituents. So please reach out to us anytime. I thank you again for participating in today's town hall meeting, and look forward to hearing from you again soon. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for participating in today's town hall. Thank you, Congressman Smith, for hosting this event. And if you have additional inquiries, or if you do not have time to get to your questions, please reach out to Congressman Smith's office using his website, adamsmith.house.gov/contact. Thank you, and have a great rest of your Saturday. This concludes our town hall.